Sometimes in life, the small events, the small decisions can have huge impact, massive consequences. I was thinking this last week that back in 2012, over a decade now, which is kind of amazing to me, I was deciding to go to seminary. And I had chosen between two schools, the Episcopal Divinity School, then in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the General Theological Seminary, then in Manhattan in New York City. Both were good seminaries. I could have gotten a good education at either, but I had to choose between them. This is one of those choices where you probably won't know whether you made the right choice until after you've already made it, until after you've been through school and experienced it, and only then know the school well enough to know whether that was the right one. A lot of decisions like that in life, right? You have to make it with rather imperfect and limited information. Ultimately, as many of you know, I decided on General in Manhattan. I just felt like I was going to get a little bit more of what I needed from seminary at that particular school. I'm sure if I had gone to EDS, I could have gotten a good education and continued with my vocation. However, this decision ended up having huge consequences for me. Again, as many, although not all of you know, I met my wife Anne at seminary, at the General Theological Seminary. If I had gone to a different school, it's likely we never would have met. And it's hard to marry someone if you never meet them. The consequences, of course, just keep flowing. If Anne and I hadn't gotten married, then Maggie over here and our son Zeke, Maggie turned, she heard me. Yes, we're talking about you. Maggie and Zeke would not be with us, of course. But it doesn't even end there. The only reason that I ended up moving to Washington, D.C. is because Anne got her first job as a priest at St. Margaret's near DuPont Circle. That's why I ended up moving here. And the only reason I even knew that St. Augustine's was looking for a new priest in 2019 was because I was already in the diocese. And I met with diocesan staff and they told me that you all were looking for a new priest. I wouldn't be here today preaching this sermon if I had gone to a different seminary. Even if I had ended up going on and being ordained and preaching somewhere this Sunday, it wouldn't have been here. Those small decisions in life can have huge ramifications, huge consequences, and of course, often consequences that we don't predict and indeed cannot predict. I could not have known everything that would flow from that one decision. I think this basic lesson, the importance of the small events and the small decisions, is also a lesson given to us today in our Hebrew Bible reading from the book of Exodus. And if you need to get a refresher, with 3 readings in front of you, it starts on page 6. We hear a story that perhaps many of you know. We're right at the beginning of the book of Exodus. We've just finished the book of Genesis. Throughout summer, you've been hearing from the book of Genesis. Now, when we left off at the end of Genesis, things were looking pretty good for Israel. At that point, we're still talking about Israel was a one guy, Israel, who started life as Jacob, and his sons and his extended family have moved into Egypt because there's a famine back in Canaan. And at that time, they're welcomed into Egypt as honored guests. But Exodus, we jump forward maybe about 400 years in the timeline, and things have changed. Once honored guests, the Israelites, or the Hebrews, as they're often called in Egypt at this time, are no longer honored guests, but now they have become enslaved. And indeed, the pharaoh, the king of Egypt, is worried about this enslaved population. He sees them growing and he worries that they might rebel against him. And so he issues an edict to begin to kill young Hebrew boys when they're born, to limit the population, and especially to limit the number of Hebrew men that are around to take up arms, perhaps resist his power. We hear a story, of course, about some very brave midwives who refuse to go along with this program. But nevertheless, Pharaoh finds out that they are not implementing his attempted genocide, and so he finds others to do this work for him. This, of course, puts Hebrew fathers and mothers into a terrible situation. And we hear about just such a family a little bit later in the reading. A woman has given birth and she's hid her son as long as she can. Not an easy thing to do, to hide a newborn. They tend to make a lot of noise, right? Finally, she realizes that she's endangering the rest of her family by keeping him there. And so she makes a horrible decision. She makes, it's called a basket, but what's interesting is that the Hebrew word is the same word that we use for ark, like the ark that Noah rode out on. Indeed, the Ark of the Covenant. It's a sealed box. She makes this sort of sealed box, this sort of floating crib, and she hides him in the reeds, not knowing what will happen to him. It's not safe to hide a baby in the Nile River. There are lots of wild animals there. This little box could tip over and the boy could drown, but she knows that if he stays with her, he will not survive. And it just so happens that we're told Pharaoh's daughter, this Egyptian aristocrat, this member of the royal household, just happens to be walking down by the water at the very same point that this little boy has been put in this little floating crib. And she sees this boy. This is a crucial moment in the life of this boy, but it's really not a big deal for the woman. She's the daughter of Pharaoh. She has dozens, maybe hundreds of people enslaved and serving her. She could command anything she wanted, really, and it would be done. This is one life of not even an Egyptian person, but a Hebrew person, someone well below her. She could just walk on and ignore the boy, and it really wouldn't be a problem for her. Indeed, she could turn the boy in to the authorities and perhaps gain some favor with her father, who also happens to be basically the dictator of her country. Or she could choose to intervene and save the boy. She could choose apathy or she can choose compassion. Her choice will have a huge impact on the boy, but it's really not a big deal for her. She's a very powerful person. She probably sees life given and taken all the time. But luckily for the boy, she chooses compassion. She takes pity on him and takes him in. And by a sort of curious maneuver by the boy's family, they actually end up getting his mother, the boy's mother, brought into the woman's household to care for her own son, although the daughter of Pharaoh, this aristocrat, doesn't realize that that's what's happened. Considering the terrible circumstances that this boy was born into, this is probably the best possible outcome for him. And this woman's decision there by the Nile River to intervene, to choose compassion instead of apathy, is just one quick decision, but it has massive consequences. Not just for Moses, obviously, whose life is saved, but this Moses is the boy who will go on to grow up and be the man who leads his people out of slavery. Thousands, tens of thousands of Israelites will achieve freedom, in part because this woman chose that one day at the river to save a life instead of walking on. But again, the consequences don't end there. This same Moses will receive the law from God, Torah. This same Moses will meet God in the burning bush in Sinai. This Moses essentially founds Judaism. Judaism exists in part because of Moses, and Moses only exists in part because this woman saved his life. And my friends, let's not forget, right? We Christians pay a lot of attention to Jesus. That's kind of our thing. Jesus was and is Jewish. Without Judaism, there is no Jesus. Without Jesus, there is no Christianity. Without Moses, there is no Christianity. Without this woman's decision by the Nile River, we wouldn't be here doing this today. Her one choice, this small event, and for her, really, not a very important decision. She probably had to make dozens of more significant decisions that day, considering her power. But this one decision had these huge consequences for this boy and his family, to be sure, but ultimately for the world. And this fact that the small events, the small decisions in life can have big consequences, it actually can be kind of scary and overwhelming, right? To think that every little decision I make could potentially have world-changing consequences. It's not really a comfortable thing to realize, especially when we realize how many of our decisions we really don't know the right move to make. We lack the information we need to make a good decision. If I'm at the store and I'm choosing between a blue t-shirt and a red t-shirt, I don't want to feel paralyzed by the fear that which shirt I choose might have world-changing consequences. How can I choose between them? And it's true that there are a lot of decisions where we just don't know. We do our best and we move on. But I think that we can learn something from this Egyptian aristocrat. Because there are some decisions in life that just seem morally neutral. Red shirt, blue t-shirt. It doesn't seem that there's a moral dimension to that, right? But there are other small decisions in life where there seems to be a better and a worse response, right? For this woman finding this little boy floating in the river, the choice of apathy was a choice of non-compassion, but the choice to intervene was the choice of compassion. And if we think that compassion is generally a good thing, then we can see that even in this small decision, there was a moral weight here. To intervene, to do something good, or to walk away, and essentially, through inaction, right, things left undone, as we'll say later, do something bad. This can guide us, because in the small decisions in life, we might want to pause and say, well, even in a small thing, is there a morally better choice? Is there a kinder choice, a more compassionate choice, a more selfless choice? Maybe choose that one, even if it's something really small and seemingly inconsequential. If I'm walking through the grocery store and a box of cereal has fallen on the ground, it's not a big deal. I could just walk on by. And, it's not my job to clean up the grocery store. But I could choose to stoop down and pick it up and put it back on the shelf. Only takes me a moment or two. And it probably won't have any big impact on the history of the world. But, come closing time at 10 or 11 at night, that's one less thing that the grocery store workers have to do before they can lock up and go home. And that might be of some value to them. As I'm leaving the grocery store, if someone is behind me but a little ways off, I could just walk through the door and keep on going, or I could choose to pause and hold it for a few seconds. It's not a big decision. Opening a door for most people isn't some really difficult task. But perhaps that person's having a really bad day, and they feel like everyone around them is just cruel and awful and against them. And perhaps that one decision to just hold the door for them, that one little sign of kindness, might change things for them. Probably not, but maybe. Most babies who are saved don't go on to found religions and liberate people from slavery, but every so often, they do. These small decisions in life can have big consequences. And so I hope that we'll pay attention to those small decisions and that we'll learn from Pharaoh's daughter. That like her, we'll choose, even in the small things, as well as the big things, but even in the small things, that we'll choose compassion over apathy. And by doing that, we might open up new possibilities for God's grace to enter our world. My friends, may it be so. Amen.